I have the great pleasure of having Robert Hill in the class with us. Robert is currently Chancellor of the University of Adelaide. He is Chairman of the Australian Carbon Trust, and he's also Adjunct Professor in Sustainability at the US Study Centre, where he's leading a whole bunch of interesting programs with important partners. So we have a soil carbon project with the University of Sydney. We have a comparative water project with Stanford University in California. I want to thank Robert for doing all of that for us. Of course, Robert came to the US Study Centre from a full life lived in politics. He was an Australian senator representing his native South Australia for 25 years. In the past 15 years, he has held the following three positions for the Australian government. First, he was Australian Environment Minister from 1996 to 2001, during which time he led Australia's involvement in the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol. From 2001 to 2006, he was Defence Minister in the Australian government, heading Australia's involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq. And from 2006 until 2009, he was Australian Ambassador at the United Nations in New York, leading Australia's bid to become a member of the Security Council. Those were all pretty big jobs. So it was certainly a real benefit to the United States Study Centre and the Sydney University that Robert agreed in 2009 to come and work with us. There is no doubt that Robert is one of not only Australia's but the world's most experienced and knowledgeable people about climate change. He's also got this irritatingly Australian self-effacing model that means that I'm not allowed to say anything nice about you for more than 5 seconds. So I'll just drag this out for as long as it's humanly possible. In the world of American hyperbole, everyone is the world's greatest expert on everything. In this case, it happens to be true that Robert knows more about climate change policy in Australia, in the US, and the world than almost anybody. So it is an enormous pleasure to have him here today. Robert, thanks for joining us. Now, as is the case with government officials or former government officials, the rules of the game today are that I and we can ask Robert any question we want, but he's free to answer those questions in any way he wants. So let me start, Robert, at the top with what I think for Australian students is probably a really important perspective point, which is the differences between the national psyches regarding climate change in Australia and the US. And let me just prompt that with a little bit of personal biography for me. When I returned to Australia in the middle of 2008, it was when the Garnaut report was out. And I was just struck by the almost religious fervour with which Australians seem to care about climate change. It didn't matter whether Australia was acting alone or internationally. There was just it was the greatest moral challenge of our time, and the country seemed to be gripped by it. I just left the United States, where climate change seemed to be a secondary issue. Yes, we care about carbon emissions, but we care about them mostly because of energy security. America's been dependent on Middle East oil too long. Sure, we've got to deal with climate change, but energy security is more important. Do you think that's a fair characterization of the fundamental? Are there fundamental differences between the way Australians and Americans think about climate change?
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction.
It was all true, by the way.
No, I don't think there are fundamental differences. Particularly if you, depends who you're talking to. If you're talking to the young generation in the US and Australia, I think their views are fairly similar. This is a serious issue, and we should be making an effort. We, Australia, should be making an effort. We, the United States, should be making an effort. It is true that from a public policy perspective, in the US, energy security is a bigger issue than it is in Australia.
There's quite a bit of energy in Australia.
Quite a lot of coal. And, but they think of it in terms of strategic security more than we do, so there's been a great focus on oil, because you need oil to run the machines of war. But I don't think that's really your starting point that there's a fundamental difference between us. I don't agree with that.
Okay, good. So then let's go back to Kyoto, negotiating Kyoto. So you were involved in that process, leading the Australian team. I want to ask you, just to remind us all, what was so important about the Kyoto Protocol. It's now ancient history, 10 years ago. And then I want to ask you a question about, you said that the US and Australia had similar views on climate change as countries. Australia and the US stood out in the early 2000s as the two developed countries that didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So I was wondering why the Howard government did not ratify, and how important the apparent implausibility of the Senate, the US Senate, ratifying Kyoto was to Australia's decision. So two parts. Why was the Kyoto Protocol so important? And if it was so important, why did neither Australia nor the US ratify it?
Well, there were a number of questions there. I guess both Australia and the US recognise the economic significance of the Kyoto Protocol. The Framework Convention on Climate Change in '92 basically set aspirational goals and talked about accounting and so forth, but didn't provide any legal obligations on the party, so no one had to take any specific economic sacrifice in terms of the framework.
So the beginning, just to get everybody on the same page, the beginning is Rio 1992.
We can go back a bit before that. I guess for a few decades before, there was a growing concern about human-induced climate change, and that led to setting up of the International Panel on Climate Change.
By the United Nations? No?
By the, associated with the UN, yes, by the World Meteorological Bureau and UNEP, which is a United Nations institution, and that fed the debate in a few years before '92. The convention was negotiated over only about 18 months, pre-1992. So there was almost global consensus that this was an issue that needed to be addressed. And because the Framework Convention is not threatening in itself in terms of economic cost, it received very widespread.
Okay, so Rio said...
Rio then,
yeah.
So the negotiations finished just before the Rio conference. So Rio, in effect, adopted the convention, and within 2 years it would come into effect, including being passed overwhelmingly by the US Senate.
Okay, so it said climate change is a real issue and we, the world, need to reduce our carbon emissions.
We have to avoid damage as a result of human behaviour.
Okay.
But then the concept under the Framework Convention was that there would be protocols that would place real costs on parties. They had to actually achieve reductions. Everybody knew that would be an economic cost. Therefore, it's what rubber hits the road, as they say. So that really came a couple of years later. The convention came into being, into operation in 1994. And the first conference of the parties was the following year, 1995, in Berlin. And that was the negotiation that was basically who was going to accept this legally binding burden. And it was decided in that negotiation that the developed world would be the party that accepted a burden, and there would be a negotiation of that deal, and that would be implemented through a protocol that would be agreed 2 years later Kyoto.
Okay, so then you were in government, and now you've got to negotiate this deal.
Yeah.
How did that go?
So I got in, when I came into the portfolio in 2006, there was a raging debate taking place across the world.
1996.
Sorry, what did I say?
2006.
19...
These decades, they're
I'm getting on, you've got to correct me. So 1996, there was a raging debate going on around the world in this field on what would be the burden, what would be the price that countries would pay, whether you would be allowed to have flexibility mechanisms to reduce those costs, and so forth. And that was all part of negotiating what was to become the Kyoto Protocol. But both the United States and Australia were very focused on the economic costs.
But this was Al Gore's US.
Well, I was about to say to you, the Senate may have reflected a slightly different America than Al, or really Clinton. Gore was just doing business at Clinton, than what Clinton's America. Because the Senate already at that time was saying, yes, we should be doing something, but we don't sacrifice American values, etc., etc. And that same view was being held in Australia. But what was happening were the developed countries were basically doing the sums on what a certain commitment would mean in terms of their economic costs.
But the Europeans, in the Kyoto negotiations, the Europeans seemed more accepting of embracing real costs on the European economy than was the case either for Australia or the US. That's the after-the-fact rendering of this. Was that true in the negotiations, or was there really a more broad-based consensus about what needed to be done?
Well, that was the European spin, that basically they would accept more. But everyone knew that nobody would agree. No one had to agree anything really. So what you're prepared to agree, and nobody was prepared to agree any more than anybody else when it comes to the crunch. So an equivalence of effort was what was being. The attempt was to determine an equivalence of effort to very different economies. That was the complexity of the negotiation.
Okay,
the European spin was we will accept more, and on the face of it, you could say it seemed that they were prepared to accept more, but under the rules they were given special advantages. They were allowed to negotiate as a bloc, and they were allowed to mix and match between the countries of Europe to achieve a European target.
Right, because the EU is a negotiating party in international agreements, so they can do
a
that.
special status in this agreement. So the US, for example, didn't have that same privilege.
Yep.
If you say roughly the US economy equivalent to the whole of the Europe economy, the Europeans had a negotiating advantage. So in a country in Europe where the cost of development was lower, they, in their own internal calculations, would be prepared to take a higher cost in that country and offset it against another country where the cost of development.
Okay, so this is way on the inside. What was remind us what the headline commitment of Kyoto was?
Kyoto was supposed to be minus 5% off of 1990
levels
to be achieved in this current accounting period, which expires in 2012.
Okay, so over
count between 2008 and 2012.
Okay,
so it was supposed to lead to a significant reduction in emissions. And remember that at this time, the world's changed very rapidly in the last 10 years, but at that time, people were still believed that the major emitters were all going to be from the developed.
Okay, so let's leave China aside for a second. The two questions about Kyoto now, very specifically. One, the Europeans say they've met their Kyoto targets. Have they? And have Australia and the US, even though Australia only ratified under Rudd and the US still hasn't ratified? How effective has Kyoto been?
Well, all of this could have been done, whatever the outcomes have been, they could have been done without Kyoto. But what has been how have countries gone in meeting the targets of Kyoto? Europe, I think, is basically, I don't notice that one, but I think basically Europe is...
They certainly say they've done it.
I think they're pretty much on target. with the advantages that they've got, and they introduced an emissions trading scheme to help them achieve it. So basically they did put a cap on it, and then they were able to mix and match under their cap to achieve it. Australia is basically on target to meet its Kyoto obligation. Australia was given a particular clause that others didn't have the benefit of, which I don't talk about tonight. And the US is not on target nowhere near on target to meet its, and others like Canada are a long way behind.
Okay, so Australia's on target, the US isn't, but neither the Howard government nor the Bush government pushed for ratification of Kyoto, a deal that you negotiated, and I presume you were quite comfortable with the deal you got for Australia. Why did neither government want to ratify this deal?
Well, Howard, a distinction is that Howard said from the start that Australia was committed to meet its target for ratifying. So, and when Mr. Rudd became Prime Minister and went off to Bali and was a global hero and said we ratified, we're actually on target to meet our Kyoto commitment. So it was pretty good in politics because the visual out there was that by going to Bali and saying we were ratified, but we were doing something extra in substance.
So that's a bit perplexing. Australia's doing it de facto but not taking the credit by not ratifying and in fact taking a bunch of heat. So what was the thinking in the government that led to that?
Well, the real thinking was, it gets back to the United States because the US is the world's largest economy and it was also the world's largest emitter. And if you're talking about what is an effective response to climate change, you can't have an effective response without the United States.
Although I said that in 2008 in Australia and I got dumped on like a ton of bricks for either being pro-American or being, mealy-mouthed, because of course Australia should do the right thing, even if it's only 1% of global emissions or whatever it is, we should do the right thing anyway. Who cares what the US does?
Well, I'm not opposed to leadership. If no one leads, then you don't get an outcome. That's a different question to one I set myself an answer, which is you don't get an effective global response without the United States.
Okay.
So our approach was that we wanted to keep the US in the tent. We didn't want to isolate it. And the problem was that the US accepted a very demanding target in Kyoto. Gore, you mentioned, went along to the Kyoto meeting.
Hey, you won him a Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, his subsequent events won him a Nobel Peace Prize, but on the same subject. But he went along for Clinton and upped if I recall correctly, upped the US target by 2% and demanded that everybody else do likewise. And almost everybody did, except Australia. But then they didn't ratify. The US didn't ratify. And their argument against not ratifying was really in the flexibility mechanism. So one thing is to set the target. But when we set the targets in Kyoto, the rules under which those targets would be met, how you calculate your commitment, weren't settled. They were to be settled in subsequent meetings. And the US had in mind certain rules that related to international offsets to achieve their target. So there's nothing wrong with that conceptually, because if the offsets are cheaper in Latin America, you actually get more carbon saved for the same amount of money.
But Larry Summers, I remember at the time, got in trouble for saying he wanted to export pollution to the developing world.
Well, that's, yeah, but again, this is a global issue, and it doesn't really matter whether the carbon is produced here or the carbon is produced in China. We all suffer the consequence. And where the cost of abatement was lower, for the same amount of money, you should be able to save a lot more carbon. So, but the Europeans hated that. The Europeans were of a view that you had to, that this wouldn't work globally unless the major emitters actually took their responsibility up front and addressed it domestically, domestic policies. So, 2 years later in The Hague,
what year are we up to now?
Kyoto was 1997, Hague was 99, if I recall correctly. We got to the crunch point. The US, and this was right at the end of Clinton, in fact they'd lost the election.
So it must have been 2000 then, late 2000.
Yeah, sorry. You're correct, 2000, late 2000. They lost the election, but they were still in office. It was November 2000. And
he was very busy at that time, Mr. Clinton.
There was a last chance whereby the Clintons could say, we will present to the Senate. They wouldn't have time to do it, but they would have accepted the detail of the deal of Kyoto. So it took the 3 years to negotiate the flexibility mechanisms, and in actual fact they weren't completed in Hague, they were completed until another year later. But they asked of the Europeans, they said to the Europeans, you got your bubble, that was your advantage, we want the offsets if we're going to be in the tent, and the Europeans said no, that was 3 o'clock in the morning. So, and that was Angela Merkel, who was then Environment Minister in Germany, and the French woman, all of them. He was a mayor in France, as they ministers are often mayors as well. The environment was green. Anyway, they said no, and therefore that was really the end of that. So then when Bush came in, he didn't have a package that he could ratify anyway. By which time Australia still hasn't ratified, and I think John Howard took the view, well, if the US is not going to, then we're doing better to be seen to be supported.
Yeah, so one thing for everyone in the audience to remember is that in the US, the executive branch, the president can negotiate treaties, but the Senate must ratify the treaties. The Senate doesn't necessarily have to do that, and in this case there was an indicative vote of, it was in the 90s to nothing range, saying that the Senate wouldn't ratify Kyoto, so Bush didn't even bother to bring it forward. Okay, so that's Kyoto. What we remember about Kyoto is the US didn't ratify, Australia didn't ratify. First time there were targets set for the developed world, no developing countries involved. But let's fast forward now several years to the run-up to the Copenhagen summit. Obviously Australian and American politics were quite different in 2009 than in 2000 or 2001. So both the Australian government, the Rudd government's ultimately called CRPS, was proposed, and in the United States there was a bill that passed the House of Representatives, the Waxman-Markey bill. Were the US and Australia in the same place in 2009 in the run-up to Copenhagen?
Again, more or less, yes. What had happened in the meantime is, firstly, the developing countries had grown much more rapidly than what had been anticipated. So the whole mix of global emissions was changing very quickly. So now the largest emitter, gross emitter, is China, not the United States. And so a couple of years after Kyoto, you've got the developed countries implementing measures domestically to try and achieve their targets. But it was becoming more and more apparent that you weren't going to have a global solution without bringing the major developing countries into the net as well. So a couple of years after Kyoto, a process started in another COP in Marrakesh to negotiate a formula that would enable the developing world to come into the tent. And that led 2 years later, so now we're up to 2007, the Bali meeting, Mr. Rudd.
But that's before Bali. The Howard government went to the 2000 election with its own emissions trading scheme proposal, right? That's certainly the way it's rendered now. Peter Shergold had a commission or whatever it was, a report.
That's true. But just let me do a poll.
All right.
He's the boss there, isn't he?
There's too much insurrection in the room.
So you totally distracted me. Now, let's
go back to the
No. You've got to get the fundamentals right. So Bali, the big thing about the Bali meeting was that they adopted a process to try to negotiate a formula to provide for a global response. So that's 2007, and the global response was supposed to be going to be agreed to the meeting in Copenhagen 2 years later.
But it is relevant to understand that. Yeah, but that was Kevin Rudd at Bali.
Yeah. Well, he was irrelevant to it.
Okay, don't quote me on this or Robert. Kevin Rudd was irrelevant.
He was totally irrelevant to there being a Bali mandate.
But he was
there for a process that had started 2 years before, it was endorsed in Bali, and then it was negotiated for the following 2 years, which led to Copenhagen. So after Bali, you had two negotiating tracks. One was what would be the next set of commitments on developed countries post-Kyoto, and what would be the long-term cooperative plan to bring the whole of the world in. Now that was necessary, not only because you needed that for a global solution, but in terms of US domestic politics, the administration would have to be able to go to the legislature, to the Senate in particular, and say China is going to pull its weight because of the economic consequences of one party taking a legally binding burden and the other party not. In the meantime, the trade relationship between the US and China had become so vital that the Congress was focused on anything that would give what they saw China a free kick. So so you're taking it to the next logical step of trying to find a global answer, but you're also, in doing that, trying to address the
making as domestic as possible. Okay.
Now that was also an issue in Australia. You've heard about the arguments about leakage. We can't afford to take leakage. This is the argument against taking a lead, that we're a major natural resource country. Why should we be taking a lead? What's the advantage if the plant that processes copper moves from Australia to Indonesia that doesn't have a legally binding carbon? It means that you suffer economically and the planet does not benefit.
No better off, yes.
So that was the lead up to Copenhagen. But in the meantime, the developed countries, and to some extent the developing countries, were nevertheless looking at what domestic policies they needed to achieve either a slowing of growth of carbon or a reduction of growth. And Australia started looking at a cap and trade in about 1999. Because I remember the minister who started that.
Who was that
process.
minister?
I can't remember his name, but it was far too early. It was just too hard. But it started to get a process developed. Unfortunately, it then got lost when power decided not to ratify Kyoto. The processes that were in place to achieve greater saving, emission saving, also got put to one side. But in the lead up to the 2007 election, as you have said, power dusted off that work, got Shergold in action, and it actually had a policy for a cap and trade scheme before the 2007 election. So both sides had policies for emissions trading.
Okay, so now just let's be...
And the US was similarly working on caps and trades.
But I think it's important again to have everyone on the same page here. Can you tell us in simple terms what the core elements of these national proposals were? What is an emissions trading scheme? How does it work? Why is it desirable? You know, we hear about different things. We hear about targets. We hear about emissions trading. We hear about carbon taxes.
There's lots of different varieties, but basically, let's make it simple and say we're looking at the major emitters because, you know, the reality is it's the major emitters on power stations and so forth make the big difference in Australia as the brown coal power stations in Victoria. So you cap them, you legally cap their emissions, and they can either then close down or take out some of their capacity to achieve it, or they may pay a huge amount of money to introduce new technologies to reduce their emissions. Or alternatively, within the design of the scheme, you give them the chance to buy permits under the cap. So the key thing is the cap.
And the permit is to emit more and you just pay a price for it. That's an emissions trading scheme.
I think you've got to separate the cap from the trade. I think that's what people get confused about. You legislate a cap. So you put
which can be up here or down here.
Yeah. But usually countries that have been legislated caps, if you look at the European experience, they're the most advanced, is they allow for trading of that hunger. So that somebody who can achieve their abatements cheaply, for one reason or another, will have a surplus which it can sell to somebody else.
So let me just explain this. So you've got two power plants. Power plant A figures out how to reduce its emissions, and it's got some emissions left, which it now can make money from by selling to power station B that couldn't reduce its emissions. And so that's why there's a market. It's why people call an emissions trading scheme a market-based solution.
The concept was similar to the outcome in Kyoto. The Europeans were opposed to the flexibility mechanisms, but the flexibility mechanisms, including trading between countries, was accepted. And the concept is to achieve the cap, in that instance the Kyoto cap, at lowest cost.
Okay, now what's the difference between that and a carbon tax?
The carbon tax is simply a tax on carbon emissions, and both schemes make the cost of carbon more expensive. The advantage of a cap is often set. You know what your outcome will be because you've legally set the cap. The tax, you don't know. You know what the cost is, but you don't necessarily know what the carbon outcome will be, because people may simply pay the tax and not use less electricity. But in either instance, what is designed to influence behaviour is that the price of energy goes up, the price of carbon.
Okay, good. So let's move to Copenhagen now. But I want to do the Australian and American politics in the context of Copenhagen. So ultimately, neither Australia nor the US passed its own emissions trading scheme. And the intervening event, the one that seemed to tip everything over, was the perceived failure of Copenhagen. So I want to ask you about Copenhagen in a second. But why was the Rudd government unable to pass its legislation, and why in the US did the Waxman-Markey bill not get translated into something on the healthcare or financial reform model that the Senate could pass and become American law? Was it all about Copenhagen, or was it about domestic politics?
That was all about domestic politics in both instances. Basically in Australia, when both sides were supporting ETS, there wasn't much challenge. But as it got closer and closer to a vote, because of the complexity, what are the problems with the ETS? That because straight ETS is a simple thing, but when you start thinking about who have we got to compensate and what are we going to allow here, and extractive industries and trade-affected industries and the public, it can get enormously complicated. And where both sides were supporting it, that didn't really matter because you had the votes. But when one side withdrew its support, you didn't have the votes, and you didn't have a public. You had a public that was supportive of action on climate change, as Mr. Rudd ultimately found out, but wasn't necessarily supportive of that model, because when they were forced to think about it, they didn't understand.
Okay, so was it a failure of communication, or was it the effectiveness of the Tony Abbott slogan, a great big new tax on everything?
It was both. It was, I've said it publicly, which upset Mr. Rudd. I think he made a tactical error in not seeking to sell his plan to the public in relying on politics, but you could understand if you had both sides, if you had the coalition and the Labor Party, if they both took the same policies to the electorate, supportive, you don't really think you have to sell it. So you made that mistake. But once you tell the Australian people that they're getting a great new carbon, a great new tax, and if they don't understand it, they're more likely to accept the argument that they are getting a great new tax. So he fell at that time.
Now, what happened in the US, of course, was that this Waxman-Markey bill died. One reason for that in America was that the oil price went from $150 a barrel to $50 a barrel. So, what crisis, Americans didn't seem to think they needed to act anymore, and the global financial crisis had hit, so unemployment was going up. But neither of those things would have affected the debate in Australia so much. Australia's an energy exporter, not importer, and as we now know, there was no recession in Australia. So you'd think it would have been easier to do this in Australia than in the US in 2009.
Well, as I said, I think that in legal terms, it's not a new tax, but the consequence in terms of the price of energy going up is the same. That's what it's designed to do. So
the Daily Telegraph is now running its electricity priceometer, or whatever they're calling it. And, this is just
but that's a bit unfair as well, because people say you don't want these responses to climate change because look, the price of energy is soaring, but it's soaring for other reasons. It's soaring because the infrastructure is outdated and has to be replaced and a whole lot of other reasons. We haven't got an ETS and the price of energy is still going up. But
Australia didn't worry about the oil price, and it didn't have a recession in 2009, and still it couldn't be passed here. And you think that's because once the bipartisan consensus broke down, it was just going to be too hard?
Yeah.
Okay. Copenhagen. Was the Copenhagen summit glass half full or half empty? The half empty version says, no globally binding deal. All the countries did was basically come with their best national policies, and all Copenhagen is a big ribbon tied around existing national commitments. The glass half full says no. There's really something important that happened at Copenhagen, which is that the developing world, by China, came in for the first time and tied themselves to the mast of reductions. Now, the Chinese reduction, of course, is not an emissions reduction, it's an emissions intensity of production reduction. So I looked at this just again to get the language correct. The Chinese government committed to reducing by 40% from its 2005 levels the greenhouse emissions intensity of production by 2020. So which view of Copenhagen is correct? The glass half full or the glass half empty?
Well, I think the failure of Copenhagen was to build unrealistic expectations in the lead-up to it. I thought in Bali, when they said they were going to negotiate a global agreement with legally binding targets, they were well, good lad. And 2 years later, there was still this expectation that it could be achieved. And then when it wasn't achieved, there was a great feeling of letdown. So I think that set the sort of the visuals for Copenhagen, and that was a bit unfortunate. But if you accept that getting to a new global treaty was too much to ask, then you assess what did come out of Copenhagen, and certainly there were some positives you mentioned. There was the fact that the developing world, the big developing country emitters for the first time, were voluntarily committing to energy intensity improvements, energy efficiency improvements. Secondly, there was an acceptance that adaptation, in particular to the consequences of climate change across the developing world, was going to cost a lot of money, and that only the developed world really had the capacity to pay for it. So there was a willingness to put up $30 billion by 2012, and then up to $100 billion a year thereafter to pay the developing world to meet the consequences of climate change, which was a positive. And thirdly, I think you can argue, if you don't believe we're going to get to a global agreement, this one's just too hard, Kyoto was hard enough, then it did provide a formula for an alternative way, which is that everybody puts down what their best effort, what their best bid is going to be on a voluntary basis, and you have a process of peer pressure to try and hold them to what they've said they'll be able to achieve. And in the post the atmospherics weren't too good on the last day or two. In the post-Copenhagen environment, most countries have now signed up to that formula that represents, I think, over 85% of global emissions. So there is the potential of another way forward.
Right, and so let's just underscore that. A whole bunch of countries now have committed to national targets. They're not the same targets, but they've committed to national targets. They're not enforceable by a treaty, but there is moral pressure in virtue of the fact that countries have said this in a multilateral environment. Before we move on post-Copenhagen, you were there, you just averred to the atmospherics of Copenhagen. I just wanted to ask you about a few things having to do with it. People say it was chaotic, the worst organised international event in history. Do you think that's fair? Kevin Rudd lost his temper at the Chinese, apparently, big four-letter invectives all over the place. There are other rumours that the Chinese held a meeting and excluded Obama. What was really going on in the negotiations?
Well, I think all of those are true. I think it's true that the rest of the world did listen to Mr. Rudd, not upset. But because he did have the answer, but I'm not sure what the answer was. They issued 30,000 invitations for a hall that takes 15,000, and they shoot only 15,000 would turn up 30,000 bids. So it was freezing cold, so the other 15,000 standing in the ice and snow.
Yeah, it's not so good in Copenhagen in August, let alone.
And then when they get cranky, the Danish police lose their patience and whack with sticks, and it wasn't a pretty sight.
But what about the intergovernmental part? Do you think the intergovernmental part was less convivial than in the past? More convivial?
Well, it's got harder and harder because the other 15,000 were inside the room. And you were trying to have a international negotiating process taking place with 15,000 people pushing and pulling and pouring. So it wasn't conducive to reaching an agreement. I never going to reach an agreement anyway. But then the Chinese were uncomfortable because they felt they were being put on spot. The pressure were not used to changing their negotiating position in the last minute of a conference like that. Remember, that's not the way they work. They felt they were being pressured, and that's when they became uncomfortable by fronting up to Obama and some more junior official who ran the final meetings, which upset Obama. So he was only there for about 12 hours anyway. But although he could fly home and said, I've achieved the Copenhagen Accord, this is the new way forward. And furthermore, there's nothing there that I have to take to the Senate.
No, because it's already would have been agreed to in the US.
If it was agreed, there's an agreement in Copenhagen, and then he would have a problem of having to present something to the Senate, which wouldn't have got through. One of the reasons he actually got the best outcome that he could have possibly got. I don't know whether his political acumen has been properly appreciated in that regard. Australia, on the other hand, rather held out that we could achieve a lot more than we could, so he then had to come home and try and explain why he didn't. So it was a shambles, and it wasn't a pretty sight. But I would argue that there was, in the Copenhagen Accord, nevertheless identified a way forward. And if the focus had been, is now on that, there was a chance of making progress.
Okay, good. Let's move to the future now. 3 questions about the future. One about China, one about international, one about Australia and the US. China question. Tom Friedman in the New York Times has taken to the view now that China is going to lead the world on climate change because the Chinese think 2 things. One, they don't want to pay for high-priced oil and gas, and the higher their demand goes, the more they're going to have to pay. And second, they want to lead the world on alternative technologies because that's going to make them a lot of money in the 21st century. Has China changed its views in a fundamental way, and is that going to have global ramifications? That's my first future question.
China, well, if you look at the stimulus money, everyone put a portion of their stimulus money into green growth. And China put a higher percentage than anyone else. So a large stimulus package, and put a lot of it into green growth. And by that, they meant putting it into energy efficiency, alternative energy, which is nuclear and renewable energies. Why did they do it? I guess if you go back to Copenhagen, for the first time they have been committing to improving their energy efficiency, and I think it's for a combination of reasons. One is it can save money, which they're interested in. Secondly, it can take some pressure off the demand on energy, so that's the energy security issue, cost and security. Thirdly, it has the incidental benefit of perhaps improving air quality, which is a big issue in China, in Beijing. And fourthly, I think that they did recognise there's going to be a huge global industry, particularly in renewable energies, and they would direct money to that field and basically capture the industrial potential.
So that's the ultimate irony. China leads the world to climate change, not because it cares about climate change, but because of a whole bunch of other reasons.
It may care about
but it doesn't need to care about climate change for any of those other things to be true. Okay, second question. There's another global summit coming up in Cancun, Mexico at the end of the year. Any prospects for anything major to happen there? What's going to be the future of these big international negotiations on climate change?
There's no prospect for any major. And next year's COP is in South Africa, and I don't think there's any prospect of major.
Okay, so what's the next? Is there any event like a re-election of Obama in 2012 that could change the dynamics, or are these big multilateral negotiations dead and buried now?
Well, at the time of Copenhagen, which wasn't long ago, less than 12 months ago, there was a lot more happening domestically than is happening now. There was prospects in Australia for an ETS prospects in the US. Japan is still, well, it's introduced a cap and trade on the municipality of Tokyo, but it was introducing legislation for diet, for emissions trading. Korea was committed to the combination, a hybrid emissions trading scheme and a carbon tax. So you get the big emitters through the ETS and you get the masses through the carbon tax. Chile was, Mexico was. It looked as if you're actually going to get a global process without having a global agreement, without there needing to be a global agreement. Now, a lot of those initiatives have gone by the way, or at least they've been suspended for the time being. If they are reinstated, if you start building momentum from
the bottom up rather than top down,
you may get sort of momentum then towards some form of global outcome, but I'm not sure.
Okay, so the last question then is about the domestic. Then the last question is about the domestic momentum in Australia and the US. We now have a Gillard government that seems to change its views on climate change and what to do about it pretty frequently. We had a citizens' assembly. Now we've got a whole bunch of panels. We've got an agreement with the Greens that may or may not include reviving an emissions trading scheme. In the US, the proposals seem to have died in Congress, but Obama is saying that he's going to prosecute a climate change agenda through the executive branch using the EPA. What do you think is going to happen in Australia, let's say, for the terms of the current governments? The current Gillard government and Obama between now and 2012. Any action in either country?
A lot of process. I don't think, at the national level, I don't think much outcome. In the US, there's more happening in the US at a local, regional level. You do have regional ETSs. You do have California in the new year. We'll be trading with the Amazon.
Unless the referendum initiative passes in California that says all climate change policy should be suspended, shall be suspended, until California unemployment goes from its current 13% to 5.5%.
Yeah, well, that's right. But
You're assuming that one will fail.
well, if between now and then, which is not far away, policies change, then obviously the consequences change. But as it happens, as we are at the moment, they will have a binding obligation, and they'll be allowed limited trade, international.
So you don't have to respond to whether you think this is a fair assessment or not, but based on everything you've said, it sounds like, despite the fact that Copenhagen was so vilified, it might be the high watermark for international action on climate change for quite a while.
I think in terms of global treaties, if you like legally binding agreements, then the high water mark is going to be Kyoto. But it doesn't really matter much because all this is simply a process that's designed to try and lead to a conclusion, and that is to reduce the rate of greenhouse gases globally. And it's designed to try and facilitate that objective. Other ways of doing it. I've said that although at a national level I think it's struggling in Australia, and at a national level I think it's struggling in the US, there are other ways that other things that can happen. Now, Australia did last year, this was at a national level, increase the renewable energy target, legally binding target for acquisition of renewable energy. I introduced that first legislation back in 1997 and 98, somewhere around about there. And the target we accepted then, which was supposed to destroy the Australian economy, was 2%. The target that is now legally in place in Australia is 20%. So that does lead to change.
And energy efficiency can happen.
Energy efficiency, well, enormous scope in energy efficiency, and that is happening in both Australia and the US and elsewhere. But the big picture solutions, I think Australia at the moment struggle with the foreseeable future.
Okay, that's all I had. I'm sure there are questions from the audience. Who's going to be mic monitor today? Tom, you're the man. You want to go and identify some questions for Robert?
Hi, thanks for coming. My question is not in relation to climate change, is that right?
Oh, then you're not going to ask a war question, are you?
Well, maybe. I thought, given the debate in Parliament today, I thought it was relevant. When you oversaw the deployment of troops to Afghanistan...
I think Tom probably set this question.
Did you think we'd ever see the day, almost 10 years later, when there's probably going to be Taliban ministers in a government that will leave behind them?
No, I didn't. But I think, do you want to know what the climate change ones first, or are we getting the war stories?
Well, I don't know. It's up to you. You're the boss.
Is there anything on climate change, or would you...
All right, we'll hold Afghanistan maybe for...
Yeah, no, I'm happy to answer it, but I'll just...
I just want to ask,
okay.
oh, sorry, the government which you were a part of commissioned the Upton report in 2006 into nuclear energy. Do you think that nuclear energy has a place in Australia's future energy production? If so, why? And if not, why not?
Nuclear energy is good for climate, but it's also expensive. The problem in Australia, why it's never been seriously addressed in Australia, is that we have a much cheaper, easier alternative still have. If the price of carbon rises to a certain level, then people will look at nuclear more seriously, but it has to rise considerably in the Australian context. Because we have to build up a nuclear industry and water regulatory apparatus and to establish Australia's first commercial nuclear power station would be obviously expensive undertaking.
But what about Australia's uranium exports? Australia doesn't export uranium to India, even though the US will share civilian nuclear technology with India, and even though India's emissions, dirty emissions, are slated to increase dramatically, should Australia reconsider its decision about to whom to export uranium?
Well, that's not just a climate change question, it's a strategic policy question. It really gets down to how important you think the non-proliferation treaty is in today's world. And,
which India has not signed. Is not a signatory to, has not ratified, but the United States cut its own.
This is the problem. This is the problem that under the treaty we can't sell to a party who's not a member of the NPT, and you can't sell to India, but you can sell to China even but it's a nuclear. It's under the NPT with a nuclear power. Most people, I don't want to get into a debate on this, but most people would say China has been less demanding on non-proliferation than India. That India has had a better record in non-proliferation than China. Yet, because of the technicality, we can't sell to India. So if you ask me, I would sell to India.
Next question.
Hi. In your opinion, has the healthiness of the Australian dollar and the security of our lifestyle made the Australian public more likely to support action on climate change?
More likely
to support action on climate change, given that in contrast, we're not plagued by many major university problems like the US, and which are therefore more likely to focus on these problems rather than the international issue of climate change.
So the question is, the economy is doing pretty well in Australia. Does that make it more likely that domestic action on climate change will happen here than in the US, where the economy is hurting badly?
I certainly think in the case of the US, the continuing economic difficulty is making it harder for Obama. It's in effect abandoned at least attempts in the near term to get legislation with federal
Except for more stimulus for green-collar jobs and the like. That's the only possibility. Yeah.
Whereas in Australia, they are still persevering with ETS. And I do think that when people are better off, they're more likely, they feel more comfortable about accepting an extra cost burden than if they are not. But I think it's marginal to the whole debate as to whether Australia will or the US won't. I think the right effect is. Yeah.
Hi. I was just wondering, what do you think of the criticisms of putting a price on carbon with regards to increasing inequality, both in terms of domestically and for developing countries?
Well, that's the whole debate, isn't it? That that's why the Framework Convention was structured in the way it was, and why we put a legal obligation on developed countries first. But it is, you've got to take into account equity in this debate. That's common but differentiated measures was the language used in the game, which basically means measures that you can afford. So you can look at it internationally, or look at it nationally, or you could look at it locally. So whether you're introducing an ETS or whether you're introducing a carbon tax, there will be measures of offset to help relieve the burden on those who are less able to pay. But they also add to the complexity.
So at the international level, that means lower targets later or something like that. Domestically, would it make sense to say something like, listen, we're going to cap electricity prices because they have an enormous impact on regular people, or we're going to cap petrol prices, and what we'll do is we'll impose a burden on the firms and not allow them to pass the price rises on to consumers? Is that at all a viable way forward?
Well, they're all viable in a way, but they will all involve, whether you introduce a carbon tax, but then you give rebates to the less well off, or whether you try to do it by putting the burden on the power producer. The consequences in the end to the public are the same. It's just which methodology is easier politically.
Australia and the US stood out in the early 2000s as the two developed countries that didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So I was wondering why the Howard government did not ratify, and how important the apparent implausibility of the Senate, the US Senate ratifying Kyoto was to Australia's decision. So two parts. Why was the Kyoto Protocol so important? And if it was so important, why did neither Australia nor the US ratify it?
Well, there were a number of questions there. I guess both Australia and the US recognise the economic significance of the Kyoto Protocol. The Framework Convention on Climate Change in '92 basically set aspirational goals and talked about accounting and so forth, but didn't provide any legal obligations on any party, so no one had to take any specific economic sacrifice in terms of the framework.
So the beginning, just to get everybody on the same page, the beginning is Rio 1992.
We can go back a bit before that. I guess for a few decades before, there was a growing concern about human-induced climate change, and that led to setting up of the International Panel on Climate Change
By the United Nations. No?
Particularly if you, depends who you're talking to. If you're talking to the young generation in the US and Australia, I think their views are fairly similar. This is a serious issue, and we should be making an effort. We, Australia, should be making an effort. We, the United States, should be making an effort. It is true that from a public policy perspective, in the US, energy security is a bigger issue than it is in Australia.
There's quite a bit of energy in Australia.
For a lot of coal, and but they think of it in terms of strategic security more than we do. So there's been a great focus on oil, because the oil to run the machines of war. But I don't think that's really your starting point that there's a fundamental difference between us. I don't agree with that.
Okay, good. So then let's go back to Kyoto, negotiating Kyoto. So you were involved in that process, leading the Australian team. I want to ask you, just to remind us all, what was so important about the Kyoto Protocol. It's now ancient history, 10 years ago. And then I want to ask you a question about, you said that the US and Australia had similar views on climate change as countries. And from 2006 until 2009, he was Australian ambassador at the United Nations in New York, leading Australia's bid to become a member of the Security Council. Those were all pretty big jobs. So it was certainly a real benefit to the United States Study Centre and the Sydney University that Robert agreed in 2009 to come and work with us. There is no doubt that Robert is one of not only Australia's but the world's most experienced and knowledgeable people about climate change. He's also got this irritatingly Australian self-effacing model that means that I'm not allowed to say anything nice about you for more than 5 seconds. So I'll just drag this out for as long as it's humanly possible. In the world of American hyperbole, everyone is the world's greatest expert on everything. In this case, it happens to be true that Robert knows more about climate change policy in Australia, in the US, and the world than almost anybody. So it is an enormous pleasure to have him here today. Robert, thanks for joining us. Now, as is the case with government officials or former government officials, the rules of the game today are that I and we can ask Robert any question we want, but I have the great pleasure of having Robert Hill in the class with us. Robert is currently Chancellor of the University of Adelaide. He is Chairman of the Australian Carbon Trust, and he's also Adjunct Professor in Sustainability at the US Study Centre, where he's leading a whole bunch of interesting programs with important partners. So we have a soil carbon project with the University of Sydney. We have a comparative water project with Stanford University in California. I want to thank Robert for doing all of that for us. Of course, Robert came to the US Study Centre from a full life lived in politics. He was an Australian senator representing his native South Australia for 25 years. In the past 15 years, he has held the following 3 positions for the Australian government. First, he was Australian Environment Minister from 1996 to 2001, during which time he led Australia's involvement in the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol. From 2001 to 2006, he was Defence Minister in the Australian government, heading Australia's involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq. He's free to answer those questions in any way he wants. So let me start, Robert, at the top with what I think for Australian students is probably a really important perspective point, which is the differences between the national psyches regarding climate change in Australia and the US. And let me just prompt that with my personal, a little bit of personal biography for me. When I returned to Australia in the middle of 2008, it was when the Garnaut report was out. And I was just struck by the almost religious fervour with which Australians seem to care about climate change. It didn't matter whether Australia was acting alone or internationally. There was just it was the greatest moral challenge of our time, and the country seemed to be gripped by it. I just left the United States, where climate change seemed to be a secondary issue. Yes, we care about carbon emissions, but we care about them mostly because of energy security. America's been dependent on Middle East oil too long. Sure, we've got to deal with climate change, but energy security is more important. Do you think that's a fair characterization of the fundamental... Are there fundamental differences between the way Australians and Americans think about climate change?
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction.
It was all true, by the way.
No, I don't think